Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here, and I'd like to start by thanking the organizers and sponsors and everybody who put this great show on the road. Today I'm going to be talking about structure in neural networks. We're talking about the links between learning theory and interpretability, in particular between singular learning theory and developmental interpretability. First, though, let's start with a question. Right, so at this point, it's clear that neural networks work. Right? Most long open-standing problems in computer vision, reinforcement learning, in natural language processing have now been solved by neural networks and technologies based on neural networks. The remaining problems are more a question of degree and scale than of quality. We could have AGI here in the next few years. Okay, so why? What's so special about neural networks? Well, in my view, the key ability of deep neural networks is that they're able to learn algorithms. So let me give you a few examples. I'm thinking of, for example, Wang et al.'s indirect object identification circuit, the work Neil Nand and others have done on grokking, or even older work in vision models, where Ola et al. Showed that vision models learn to compose low-level feature detectors into high-level object detectors. Right, so in each of these cases, we see that models learn to systematically, step-by-step, manipulate information from inputs to produce predictions and actions. It's as close to algorithmic reasoning as we're going to get, and it might not be perfect, but it's something algorithmic going on under the hood. This makes neural networks qualitatively unlike earlier learning machines. Take linear regression, Gaussian processes, clustering. None of these older techniques is ever going to learn to sort a list, for example. The key ability of neural networks is that they have this hierarchical and flexible internal structure that lets them internalize and reflect the underlying computational structure of the world. Okay, so what is the nature of this learned structure? Right? In computer science, we have many different ways of talking about algorithmic structure. Turing machines, Boolean circuits, lambda calculus, finite state automata. All these different models of computation are equally expressive, sure, but they're not the same things. So which is appropriate for talking about structure in neural networks? What's the right foundation for interpretability as a science? As neural networks continue to become better, these questions become more important. That's because algorithmic reasoning underlies many of the most important capabilities of real-world agents. Things like the ability to form plans and execute those plans, the ability to course correct, to adjust those plans to a changing world, the ability to model and manipulate the beliefs and intentions of other agents. We're not worried at the fact that neural networks have this encyclopedic knowledge. We're worried about how they use that information. My key concern, the concern that drives the research that I do, is that AI safety might be bottlenecked on technical progress, theoretical progress in deep learning theory. For example, in interpretability, maybe it turns out that interpreting some kinds of alignment-relevant structure requires breakthroughs in understanding what structure is. Maybe we can't understand everything in terms of this model of features and circuits that's become increasingly popular in mechanistic interpretability. More generally, my hope for theory is threefold. And it's the same hope that I have for theory in other domains. So first, can it tell us what to measure? Right? Can we build new tools? Can we go from optical microscopes to electron microscopes and beyond? Second, can theory tell us where to look, what kinds of experiments to run, and what information to ignore? And lastly, can theory, in the most ambitious case, tell us when to be confident? In a mature field like thermodynamics or statistical physics, we know what the limits of these systems are, and we know how to control and engineer those limits. Can we do the same for learning theory? And the rest of this talk, I'm going to be walking through and motivating some of the high-level story of singular learning theory and developmental interpretability. And we'll look at this link between geometry, structure, and development. Afterwards, Professor Aoyagi and my colleague Stan Van Wingerden will look at some more concrete results from the recent research over the last year. Okay, but now let's focus on this question of what the nature of learned structure in neural networks really is. But first, geometry. I want to come back to this question of what makes neural networks special, but this time answer it a little more precisely. And we'll see that singular learning theory, developed by Professor Sumio Watanabe here in Japan, offers an answer to the question of what makes neural networks special. At a very high level, SLT suggests a deep correspondence between internal structure of the model and of the data, geometric structure of the loss landscape, and structure of the learning process. Now, the idea that development and structure are related is nothing new. It's an idea that goes back to developmental biology. And in many ways, it's almost tautological, right? Structure has to be constructed. It's associated to some process of building something up out of nothing. Similarly, if you have familiarity with machine learning, then it's not surprising that geometry influences development. When we train using SGD or some variant of SGD, the gradients come from the geometry of the loss. What's perhaps more surprising is that SLT predicts it's particularly the singularities of loss, critical points and places where derivatives vanish, that determine the overall qualitative nature of the learning process. It turns learning from an effectively continuous problem into an effectively discrete problem. What's perhaps most surprising and probably most important is the idea that geometry reflects internal structure. And we'll see this worked out in the example of what's called the learning coefficient. Okay, so structure determines geometry, determines development, determines structure. If there's one key idea to take away from the talk, it's this. Okay. So that's SLT. But what actually is singular about this whole story? When I talk about singular learning theory, it's learning theory of singular models, in particular, strictly singular models that I'm interested in. And this means two conditions. So first, the parameter function map is not one-to-one. Different choices of weights can implement the same functions. Second, the Fisher information matrix is not everywhere invertible. That's equivalent to saying that the Hessian, so the matrix of second derivatives of the loss with respect to weights, has 0 eigenvalues. There are directions in weight space where the curvature vanishes. As it turns out, many results in classical learning theory assume that models are non-singular. And that means that many of these results do not apply to neural networks. Now, I don't have time to go into all of these, because there are a lot of violations, but I will highlight just a few. So first, SLT, to a large extent, solves the problem of in-distribution generalization for Bayesian learning machines. For regular models, non-singular models, the Bayes generalization error is given by the number of parameters divided by 2 times the number of samples. This predicts that for a neural network with lots of parameters, it should overfit. In fact, SLT tells us that the right number for singular models is that the Bayes generalization error is given by the learning coefficient lambda over n. And this can, in general, be much smaller than the number of dimensions. Intuitively, what's happening here is that simple models are able to occupy a greater volume of weight space. So they're easier to find. This induces an implicit regularization effect that favors simpler models that generalize further. Violation 2. So neural networks have non-Riemannian information geometry. Now, this is just the same thing as saying that the Hessian is non-invertible. Okay, so what that means is that if you want to measure the volume associated to some solution, to a basin, that you can't do that by using the Hessian. You have to go to a higher order Taylor approximation in order to capture the qualitative nature of your loss landscape. Okay, so anything based on the Hessian, it's not going to work for neural networks. Third, and most importantly, singular geometry changes the fundamental nature of learned structure and of the learning process. We'll see in a moment what that means in terms of this Bayes information criterion. So in particular, having singular geometry turns learning from a continuous problem into an effectively discrete problem. To see that, we re-express the problem of learning as a variational problem in terms of minimizing this free energy. Right? So even though the thing you think you're applying optimization pressure to is the loss, The thing you're really minimizing is this free energy, which involves a contribution both from the loss and from the learning coefficient. In order to minimize this quantity, you have to trade these off against each other. And you have to trade these off in a way that depends on the number of samples, n. As we sample more and more data, the linear term is going to dominate the logarithmic term. This will become more important, and it'll become more important to lower the loss than to lower the complexity. And the model will come to favor more accurate, lower loss solutions in exchange for a complexity cost. What's happening here is a kind of implicit data-dependent Occam's razor. Models implicitly and automatically find the right trade-off between complexity and accuracy. Now this is important because free energy minimization is the basis for model selection in classical statistics. Right? So for a regular model, called this, the learning coefficient is equal to the number of dimensions divided by 2. It's a constant. That means that minimizing this free energy for regular models simplifies the problem of just minimizing the loss. However, when you start comparing between different model classes, different architectures, you want to compare them at the level of the free energy rather than at the level of the loss. And this is done by using the Bayesian information criterion, which is this approximation to the free energy. So what that means is that for singular models where this complexity term is variable, it's not constant, it's not the same over all parameter space, singular models perform an internal version of this model selection procedure. You should see the learning process as consisting of selecting among qualitatively distinct regions of weight space, different phases. Okay, so SLT suggests this deep correspondence between geometry, structure, and development. And in particular, it tells us that singular model classes contain these algorithmically and geometrically distinct phases. So the learning process is going to be a much richer thing than learning in a regular model class where all of the models are qualitatively identical. So what about structure? Well, the place where currently you can see this relationship between geometry and structure most clearly is in the learning coefficient. This has both an algorithmic and a geometric aspect to it. On the geometric side, the learning coefficient, the local learning coefficient, measures the volume scaling rate. So suppose I have a point down here at the bottom of the loss landscape. I can ask, how many solutions are almost as good as this point? I choose some height epsilon, and I ask, what volume of weight space is available below that height epsilon? What you find is that this volume, in this case it's the area of the surface, as you get closer and closer to epsilon, scales according to some constant times epsilon to the lambda. Lambda is the local learning coefficient. So the learning coefficient is like a fractional dimension in the loss landscape. Let's see some examples. So if you have a parabolic geometry, right, x squared plus y squared, then the learning coefficient is maximal. It's d divided by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. If you have something more interesting, like x to the fourth plus y to the fourth, then the learning coefficient can be smaller, and in this case, it's 1/2. Or something even more interesting, x to the fourth times y squared, well, the learning coefficient can be smaller still. Okay, so that's the geometric side. What about the algorithmic side? Well, for so-called minimally singular models, the learning coefficient is precisely the effective dimensionality. It's the effective number of parameters in your model. If you have a parameter that doesn't contribute to the function you're implementing, you can set it to any value and it doesn't change what you're doing, then it decreases the learning coefficient by 1/2. But in full generality, the learning coefficient seems to capture more than just this. A recent note by Daniel Murfitt showed that it seems to be related to runtime error correction, the ability of some learning machine to produce the same output even if there's a mistake internally. And we expect that in general, the learning coefficient is going to capture high-level algorithmic structure like these and probably more. Okay, so both this algorithmic and geometric aspect to it. If you want to compute the learning coefficient exactly, you need the sophisticated tooling of algebraic geometry, right? It's complicated. I can't do it. And in general, this is intractable. So we don't have exact solutions for large realistic models. It might be impossible. However, fortunately, it's possible to estimate this instead. And this is thanks to recent work by my collaborators in 2 papers by Lau et al. And Furman and Lau. All right, so to estimate the learning coefficient is going to require 2 ideas. So first, we're going to use this very useful formula, this estimator for the learning coefficient that's derived from a result by Watanabe. What you see here is it expresses the learning coefficient in terms of the average increase in loss from some starting point to points around it. Okay, so the key insights are that we're going to estimate this expectation value by sampling points in the neighborhood of my reference point using SGLD, stochastic gradient Langevin dynamics, which is just take an SGD step, add a little bit of Gaussian noise, and repeat. And the second key idea is that we're going to localize. So estimating the global learning coefficient might be intractable, but if you require that your samples are close to your starting point, then it does seem to be possible, and you can do this by introducing this localizing term. Okay, so it's very easy, right? Average increase in loss from some point to points in the neighborhood. This is easier than anything you can do that's based on a Hessian. Okay, so the learning coefficient is this principled measure of model complexity. It has this geometric aspect to it that lets us estimate it, even at scale, up to models with hundreds of millions of parameters. But still, this is kind of theoretical, right? What does this actually capture? What does it mean? Well, I'll show you in 2 toy examples. So the first are deep linear networks. These are neural networks without the nonlinearities. So you get a bunch of linear transformations together, and you get another linear transformation. Right? Functionally, it's not super interesting and not very expressive. However, geometrically, and in terms of the learning process, it is a very interesting problem. And thanks to recent results by Professor Aoyagi, we now have theoretical values for this model. So we understand it better than we do under other models. What you see here is that the local learning coefficient tracks the rank of the matrix that you are implementing. So as the rank increases, the learning coefficient increases. It's very straightforward and the kind of relationship you would expect if you had to reason about what model complexity would mean in this case. Now let's look at a second example. So this is the toy model of superposition introduced by Anthropic and then later investigated by my collaborators in this paper by Chen et al. So what happens here is we have a very simple autoencoder, maps from C dimensions to R dimensions and back up to C, adds a bias, and then applies a nonlinearity, a relative nonlinearity. So a one hidden layer autoencoder. Now what you find is that if you're mapping down to 2 dimensions, then you can plot the solutions, and they form these regular polygons. Now in particular, what you end up finding is that as these shapes that are encoded by the weights of this model become more sophisticated, you go from 4 gons to 5 gons to 6 gons, the learning coefficient increases. Right, and additionally, as you start to use more of your biases, in general, the learning coefficient is going to increase. So in a very intuitive way, the learning coefficient is capturing the complexity of the form, of the structure, in a way that you can see with your eyes. Okay, so in these toy models, we're starting to get a feel for, okay, yes, actually this learning coefficient captures complexity, captures model complexity in a way we expect. And the answer we're getting about what can we learn from structure from geometry is as follows, right? Geometric degeneracy, as measured by this local learning coefficient, reflects algorithmic complexity. Now, the local learning coefficient is just a single scalar number. It's the tip of the iceberg. And we see many ways of breaking this apart, opening it further, to extract much more information about the models we're investigating. So we're just getting started. What about development? Well, let me try to introduce a developmental perspective without any reference to singular learning theory. Right? Sometimes it's the case that it's just easier to study changes and to integrate those changes than it is to study individual snapshots. And the hope of developmental interpretability is to use this idea to make interpretability easier. This doesn't require any appeal to learning theory. However, you get a very natural follow-up question, which is, what changes are you going to study? Is the relevant unit of change a single training step, or is it some larger object? And this is where SLT comes in. SLT suggests that the right unit of change is a geometric unit of change, In particular, it's a phase transition, defined in a very precise sense. So suppose we have two regions of weight space. What we can do is we can plot the free energy associated to those different regions, and we can see how that varies as you increase the number of samples. So blue is one region, orange is the other region. What you see is that as the number of samples increases, at some point the minimum of the overall free energy can jump from one solution to the other. That's a first order phase transition. The minimum of the free energy jumps to another critical point. The phase transition in the precise sense we mean in thermodynamics as well. Okay, so that's phase transitions. Are they even real? Yes. In toy models, the ones we just saw, these phase transitions exist. So you see that learning consists of a sequence of plateaus where the loss drops and the learning coefficient increases. So too in this toy model of superposition, the loss goes down, learning coefficient goes up in a stepwise fashion. Development in these models consists of phase transitions, which are geometrically determined. What about larger models? So this is still early work, but a recent paper we put out showed that in larger models, we also see this stage-wise development. If you're looking at just the loss, then you don't necessarily see any stages, right? The loss here is decreasing pretty steadily throughout all of training. But the learning coefficient shows this hidden stage-wise development. Turns out that these stages can actually be interpreted. So developmental interpretability seems interesting on its own grounds. And it's particularly when you combine it with SLT, then it starts to actually make sense. And we have early evidence that this kind of approach to interpretability is viable. So just as the singular model class consists of qualitatively distinct phases, so too the singular learning process consists of algorithmically and geometrically distinct stages. Right, to recap, we saw this relationship between structure, geometry, and development. And I asked the question, what is the nature of learned structure in neural networks? Now, this is still an open question. We don't have the final answer. But we're starting to get an answer that suggests that we should think of structure in geometric terms. Maybe a geometric approach to structure is the native one. Similarly, we should think of development as being fundamental to understanding structure. Maybe in a meaningful sense, you can't actually separate understanding structure from understanding development. There's a lot more to do. And so here, I will hand it over to all of you. Thank you.
All right. Let's bring the house lights up. And any questions from the room?
So, thanks for the interesting talk. I didn't follow everything of it, so how you exactly compute your metrics. What I'm interested in is the application. So, would it be right if I kind of speculate that, okay, if you see certain curves on the parameters that you're looking at to interpret the thing, if you see certain ways on how these parameters evolve, that would actually lead to the conclusion, okay, this model is dangerous or it might do weird things, and whereas if you see other parameters, you have the conclusion, this is probably safe and stable and will not do weird things. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
So several answers for that. So in terms of applications to interpretability, yeah, the hope is, the story you can concoct for this is the same story that you would have for any other approach to interpretability. Right? Understanding what's going on inside of the model might help you prevent dangerous abilities in the way that you described. So you want to understand where structure is forming, what the model is doing internally. As for other applications, I'm going to leave that to my colleague, who will give a talk in about 30 minutes from now. And I hope that that will answer your questions there.
Hi. So with the estimates of the local learning coefficient over multiple orders of magnitude in linear models, it was showing that it was sort of fairly accurate, but there seemed to be quite a fair bit of noise. And then with the kind of more detailed structure, we're looking at really quite subtle changes in the learning coefficient. So how can we be confident that the estimation process is really picking up the right signal there?
I'd say that like the order of estimates is more important than whether they're absolutely accurate. And we're pretty confident about that. You can do a bunch of checks for that.
Is there a particular way in which we can get that confidence about the order?
Yeah, I mean, that's further theoretical advances.
Fair enough.
That's the best answer I can give right now. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you, okay, I'm gonna have to go through, I guess, like the preprint that you shared at the end, but if you could share, say, like a few more details about scalability to larger models, because I think I can see, like, you know, if it was, say, like a larger multi-layer perceptron, I guess that, yeah, I can kind of picture that in my mind, but if it's, say, like a more complicated structure, I'm not really sure where to start, in a way, like, you know, what's the Hessian matrix? I don't even know what the Hessian matrix of some transformer is supposed to be, I guess.
Yeah, so we've been looking at GPT-2 small. So there it works. It reveals interesting structure to the learning process. That's not published yet, so stay tuned for that. It'll come out at some point soon.
Great. So you gestured briefly at something beyond the learning coefficient, and saying that this is just one number. It does seem a little implausible that just from one number you're going to get that much new insight. Could you tell us more about what you have?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think you see it here. I'm going to just leave it. So one very logical next thing you can do is look at a restricted local learning coefficient. Try to identify what part of the model is a given complexity increase coming from. So that gives you a basis for starting to do things like automatic circuit discovery. Right? If you understand that this ability all of a sudden appears at this range of training steps and you see a spike in some restricted plot showing you what part of the model is gaining structure, that's a basis for probing further.
Is it meaningful to compare the LLC to other measures of model complexity, like the VC dimension, or is the VC dimension too broad?
So I think this demonstrates a key failure of a lot of classical learning theory. A lot of model complexity measures in classical learning theory are complexity measures of an entire model class. Right? So you get one number for all neural networks you can implement with a given architecture. So VC dimension is an example of this in the case of binary classification. So that's a weakness, because when you get these very expressive model classes like neural networks, you actually want to incorporate information about where you are within the model class. What phase are you in? What subset of the model class are you located in?
A question from the live stream.
We've got a question from the live stream. Does this research help detect emerging capabilities like deception in large language models, or is that detected in terms of complexity?
That's the hope. It's still early. I can't say anything like that confidently yet. The hope is that we will be able to say stuff about deception eventually, and I think that can actually be pretty soon. If we look at setups like these sleeper agent models, places where we deliberately train these toy models of deception. Yeah. Interesting question.
Yeah, so I just have a really basic question. Is you showed the Bayesian information criterion, which had a number of parameters, and you said that was key to kind of to your argument. In general, when we train a model, we fix the number of parameters. So I guess I don't see that connection between you had the training process and structure. I don't see how the training process influences structure there. Basically, the structure, are you referring to structure as the structure of the model or as something else?
Yeah, particularly of the model. Although really you could talk about structure of the data and of the model separately. Yeah, so in terms of the link between development and structure, I guess I would appeal to a biological example. There's some particular sequence of events involved in building up the structure we are today. And when we start as a embryonic stem cell, we go through these differentiation events, and the embryo splits into these 3 layers, and those form the different organ systems of our body. So, the final structure you end up with depends in a very intimate way on the series of steps you went through.
I guess usually we fix the structure though when we train it, right? We choose we're going to train a GPT too small, and you've somehow fixed the structure there, right?
You fix a sort of external scaffold, right? But then you are allowed to fill in that structure as you see fit. And the structure internally is variable, right? One weight might not contribute if all of the ingoing activations to a neuron are 0. Then whatever the weight is that you multiply times the outgoing activation is not going to contribute to the model that you're implementing. But that's only the case if you've somehow set the ingoing activations to 0. So the structure depends on where you are in weight space and how you got there over the course of learning.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more, maybe.
Thank you for talk, Jesse. I'm particularly interested in trying to understand the loss structure, right? And you normally think of it as sort of, you have like a manifold that's cut out of a higher dimensional space or something that you're traversing. But singular learning theory suggests that it's more like an algebraic variety that we should be thinking of, where we have to think about the particular singularities that are there. Can you give a sense of like what kind of singularities are we dealing with? What is a different way of conceptualizing this landscape?
Yeah. So I should say it's the level sets, right, are varieties. I don't have a good answer to this question yet. There's a lot of work to do here. You can see in certain toy examples, many of these examples where you just remove a parameter, right, where you just cut it out and then for some duration you can walk in that direction in parameter space and it just doesn't do anything, so it's flat. And we expect that there are more interesting kinds of degeneracy where you get like a quartic contribution as you walk in the direction. And you see that in that example of this error correction in a slightly different setup. So it's not a neural network, but probably is still related to something you would see in real neural networks.
All right, thank you. I look forward to getting more insight into some of this later when we talk.
Okay, thank you everyone.
On that note of getting more insight, do applaud. Thank you.
My pleasure. Do you want a handshake?
Yeah.